Hello and welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. We're continuing to go through a series of videos on the evidence for the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. If you have found value in my work here on YouTube, please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing my published work, a 30-chapter volume on the first 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms. It's available on Zulon Press, it's available on Amazon, it's available elsewhere where books are sold. The content of this presentation is coming from Josh McDowell's The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. It's the chapter on the evidence for the resurrection. Future presentations will contain information from this book here, Norm Geisler and Frank Turek's I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. So this time we're going to talk about inadequate theories about the resurrection. Winfried Corderon comments on the alternative theories to the resurrection en masse. Corderon says non-miraculous explanations of what happened at the empty tomb have to face a cruel choice. Either they have to rewrite the evidence in order to suit themselves, or they have to accept the fact that they're not consistent with the present evidence. The only hypothesis that fits the evidence is that Jesus was really resurrected. Could the man who predicted his death and resurrection only to have it come to pass exactly as he had said be anything but God? J.N.D. Anderson says, concerning the testimony that history gives to the resurrection, a point which needs stressing is that the evidence must be considered as a whole. It's comparatively easy to find an alternative explanation for one or another of the different strands which make up this testimony, but such explanations are valueless unless they fit the other strands in the testimony as well. A number of different theories, each of which might conceivably be applicable to part of the evidence, but which do not themselves cohere to and into an intelligible pattern, can provide no alternative to the one interpretation which fits the whole. So you can't just break apart all the parts that make up the evidence for the resurrection. You've got to consider it as you got to consider all the parts together to arrive at the best conclusion. So we've been talking about inadequate theories about the resurrection. These are the different theories. This time we're going to talk about the Swoon Theory. The Swoon Theory holds that Christ never actually died on the cross, but he only swooned. When he was placed in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, he was still alive. After several hours, he was revived by the cool air. He arose from the tomb and departed. He never really died. That's what the Swoon Theory advocates. J.N.D. Anderson says this theory was first put forward by a man named Venturini a couple of centuries or so ago. It's been resuscitated in recent years in a slightly different form by a heterodox form of Muslims called the Ahmadiyya, who used to have their main headquarters at a place called Qadian, who have their English headquarters in a part of London called Putney. Their explanation runs like this. Christ was indeed nailed to the cross. He suffered terribly from shock, loss of blood, and pain, and he swooned away, but he didn't actually die. Medical knowledge was not very great at that time, and the apostles thought Christ was dead. We're told, are we not, that Pilate was surprised that he was dead already. The explanation assertedly is that he was taken down from the cross in a state of swoon by those who wrongly believed him to be dead, and laid in the sepulchre. And the cool restfulness of the sepulchre so far revived him that he was eventually able to issue forth from the grave. His ignorant disciples couldn't believe that this was a mere resuscitation. They insisted it was a resurrection from the dead. That's just a definition of the Swoon Theory. Ernest Kevan, whom we've heard from in previous presentations, says of the Swoon Theory that also responsible for Christ's resuscitation were the reviving effects of the spices with which he'd been embalmed. So not only the pleasant climate of the comfortable climate of the tomb, but the spices that they had wrapped him with all woke him up. So now we're going to refute the Swoon Theory. Anderson says, this theory does not stand up to investigation. Simply put, concise, succinct. W.J. Sparrow-Simpson says the Swoon Theory is obsolete. Josh McDowell says Christ did die on the cross according to the judgment of the soldiers, according to the judgment of Joseph, and according to the judgment of Nicodemus. Oh, and they pierced his side, which was supposed to go through his heart. So if the asphyxiation and the suffocation and the shock of the blood loss didn't kill him, certainly the spear in the side did, I would think. Okay, Paul Little in Know Why You Believe writes in reference to the swoon theory, it's significant that not a suggestion of this kind has come down from antiquity among all the violent attacks which have been made on Christianity. All the earliest records are emphatic about Jesus' death. No mere swoon, he really did die. In fact, in the minimal facts argument by Gary Habermas, one of the minimal facts that even non-Christian historians agree on is the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion. So even skeptical people will, many of them agree that Christ actually died, which puts to death, no pun intended, the swoon theory. T.J. Thorburn, in his Resurrection Narratives and Modern Criticism, mentions the following as what Christ suffered at the hands of Pilate: the agony in the garden, the arrest at midnight, the brutal treatment in the hall of the high priest's palace and at the praetorium of Pilate, the exhausting journeys backwards and forwards between Pilate and Herod, the terrible Roman scourging, the journey to Calvary, during which he fell exhausted by the strain upon his powers, the agonizing torture of the crucifixion, and the thirst and feverishness which followed. So you're going to tell me that he went through all this stuff that Thorburn lists, and merely swooned, didn't really die, after having his wrists pierced and his Achilles pierced, and having the crown of thorns pressed into his scalp, and having the spear thrust into his side? He didn't really die. Really? Thorburn observes, it would be difficult to imagine even the most powerful men, after enduring all these, not succumbing to death. Moreover, it's recorded that the victims of crucifixion seldom recovered, and even under the most favorable circumstances. Yeah, the Romans made sure that their victims died. Thorburn concludes, we cannot state the insuperable objections to this theory better than in these words. Then, says Keim, there is the most impossible thing of all, the poor, weak Jesus, with difficulty holding himself erect, in hiding, disguised, and finally dying. This Jesus, an object of faith, of exalted emotion, of the triumph of his adherents, a risen conqueror and Son of God. Here, in fact, the theory begins to grow paltry, absurd, worthy of only rejection. Yes, it is absurd. Okay, Anderson remarks on the hypothesis that Jesus did not die. Well, it's very ingenious, but it won't stand up to investigation. To begin with, steps were taken, it seems, to make quite sure that Jesus was dead. That surely is the meaning of the spear thrust in his side. Yes, as I said a few moments ago. But suppose, for argument's sake, that he was not quite dead. Do you really believe that lying for hour after hour with no medical attention in a rock-hewn tomb in Palestine at Easter, when it's quite cold at night, would so far have revived him, instead of proving the inevitable end to his flickering life, that he would have been able to loose himself from yards of grave clothes weighted with pounds of spices, roll away a stone that 3 women felt incapable of tackling, and walk miles on wounded feet? Right. So a mere human would be able to do these things? Not in the slightest, Anderson says. Of course, Jesus was no mere human, he's God in the flesh. And so he rose from the dead. John Stott asks, are we to believe that after the rigors and pains of trial, mockery, flogging, and crucifixion, he could survive 36 hours in a stone sepulchre with neither warmth nor food nor medical care? That he could then rally sufficiently to perform the superhuman feat of shifting the boulder which secured the mouth of the tomb, and this without disturbing the Roman guard? That then, weak and sickly and hungry, he could appear to the disciples in such a way as to give them the impression that he had vanquished death? That he could go on to claim that he died and risen? Could send them into the world, could send them into all the world and promise to be with them until the end of time? That he could live somewhere in hiding for 40 days, making occasional surprise appearances, and then finally disappear without any explanation? Such credulity is more incredible than Thomas's unbelief. Okay, Camus says of modern rationalists who deny Christ's resurrection. They say if he's risen, he was not dead, or if he died, he's not risen. Two facts, one as certain as the other, throw light in this dilemma. The first is that on Friday evening Jesus was dead, and the second, that he appeared full of life on Sunday and on the days that followed. That he was dead on Friday evening no one has doubted, neither in the Sanhedrin nor in the Praetorium nor on Calvary. Pilate alone was astonished that he had so soon given up the ghost, but his astonishment only called forth new testimony corroborating the assertion of those who asked for his body. Yeah, there's no denying that he was dead. So then when he appeared again on Sunday, it had to be a resurrection from the dead. Camus continues, therefore, friends and enemies looking on the crucified saw clearly that he was no more. To prove it the better, the centurion pierced him with his lance, and the corpse made no motion. From the wound came forth a mixture of water and blood, which revealed a rapid decomposition of the vital elements. Bleeding, they say, is fatal in syncope. Here, it has not killed him who was already dead. For the circumstances in which it occurred prove that Jesus had ceased to live some moments before, and it does not occur at the most intelligent of his enemies, such as the chief priest, to cast doubt on the reality of his death. All that they fear is fraud on the part of the disciples, who may remove the body, but not on the part of Jesus, whom they have seen expire. Yes, even the Jewish religious leaders did not think that Jesus could still have been alive. They did not think that he merely would have swooned. They were trying to make sure that the disciples couldn't steal the body, like Camus says. Camus, he was taken down from the cross, and just as he had shown no sign of life at the stroke of the soldier's spear, so now he lies still in the cold and loving arms that lift him up, take him away, embalm and shroud, and lay him in the tomb, after covering him with proofs of their desolation and their love. Can we imagine a more complete swoon than this, or one more suitably timed? Let us add that this would indeed be a most fortuitous ending of a life already in itself so prodigious in its sanctity and so fecund in its influence. This were an impossible coincidence. It were more miraculous even than the resurrection itself. Yes, for this to be a mere swoon, Camus almost sarcastically says, for this to be a mere swoon would require a bigger miracle than the resurrection itself. Now we're going to look at the life of Jesus from Strauss. Skeptic Strauss. Even this skeptic says that Jesus couldn't have swooned. It's impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, who crept out weak and ill, wanting medical treatment, in other words, needing medical treatment, who required bandaging, strengthening, and indulgence, who still at last yielded to his sufferings, could have given the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave, the Prince of Life, an impression which lay at the bottom of their future ministry. Such a resuscitation could only have weakened the impression which he had made upon them in life and death. At the most, could only have given it an elegiac voice, but could by no possibility have changed their sorrow into enthusiasm, have elevated their reverence into worship. Right? If he had merely swooned, he wouldn't have been the object of worship that he is. If he had merely swooned, they would not have had the reaction that they did after they realized that he actually had risen from the dead. William Milligan, in refuting the Swoon Theory, says in describing Jesus' appearance to his disciples, he says that they were not those of a sick chamber, but of health and strength and busy preparation for a great work to be immediately engaged in. Despondency has given place to hope, despair to triumph, prostration to all energy, to sustain vigorous exertion. Right, so the reaction of the disciples shows that this is no mere swoon. When the first fears of the disciples were dispelled, it was one of joy, of boldness, enthusiasm. Milligan continues, we see none of those feelings of pity, sympathy with suffering, of desire to render help, that must have been called forth by the appearance of a person who had swooned away through weariness and agony, who continued in unconsciousness from Friday afternoon to Sunday morning, and who was not only in the first moments of recovery. Yes, if he had merely swooned, the disciples would not... They would have reacted with more concern for Jesus and trying to help him rather than rejoicing about his presence with them again, as they did, which is the rejoicing rather than seeking to help him is indicative of a resurrection rather than a swoon. Okay, Ernest Hermitage Day, in his evidence for the resurrection, says in the narratives of various appearances of the risen Christ, there's no hint of any such physical weakness as would have been inevitable if Christ had revived from apparent death. The disciples, in fact, saw in their risen master not one recovering against all expectation from acute sufferings, but one who was Lord of life and conqueror of death, and who was no longer fettered as they had known him to be in the days of his ministry by physical limitations. Right, that was his resurrection body, that was his glorified body, that was his proof that he was no mere man but also deity. Okay, this would be McDowell. Those who propose the swoon theory would also have to say that Jesus, once he had revived, was able to perform the miracle of wiggling out of the grave clothes that were wound tightly about all the curves of his body and leave without at all disarranging these. Right, yes. He couldn't mess up the grave clothes. He's going to have to awake from his swoon, and he's going to have to somehow leave the tomb in such a state that it would be found by those who found the tomb. Now we're going to look at Merrill Tenney, who explains the grave clothes. He says, in preparing a body for burial, according to Jewish custom, it was usually washed and straightened and then bandaged tightly from the armpits to the ankles in strips of linen about a foot wide. Aromatic spices, often of a gummy consistency, were placed between the wrappings or folds. They served partially as a preservative and partially as a cement to glue the cloth wrappings into a solid covering. John's term, bound, is in perfect accord with the language of Luke 23:53, where the writer says that the body was rolled in linen. On the morning of the first day of the week, the body of Jesus had vanished, but the grave clothes were still there. The wrappings were in position where the dead had been, separated from the others by the distance of the armpits to the neck. The shape of the body was still apparent in them, but the flesh and bone had disappeared. How was the corpse extricated from the wrapping, since they would not slop over the curves of the body when tightly wound around it? Yes, why are the clothes still taking the shape of the body if the body's not in the clothes, in the wrappings? Why are the wrappings still taking the shape of the body if the body's not in the wrappings? Those who hold to this theory, James Rosscup says of the swoon theory, have to say that Christ, in a weakened condition, was able to roll back the stone at the entrance of the tomb, a feat which historians would take several men, step out of the sepulchre without awaking any one of the soldiers, if we assume for argument's sake that they were asleep, and we know that they certainly weren't, and step over the soldiers to escape. Yes, how could he get out of the tomb and get past the soldiers without them trying to do something? And why do we not hear about the soldiers going back to the Jews or Pilate saying what happened? Day, in the evidence for the resurrection, said the physical improbabilities of the supposition are indeed overwhelming. Even if we're able to reject the account of the guarding of the sepulchre in obedience to the dictates of a criticism which finds in it an inconvenient incident, there remains the difficulty of supposing that one but just recovered from a swoon could have rolled away a stone from the door of the sepulchre, for it was very great. Right. Day says what we've said. One of the pieces of evidence that works against the swoon theory is the fact that no mere human could have rolled away that stone. McDowell says it's absurd to suppose that Jesus could have fought off the Roman guard even if he had managed to roll away a stone, if he was a mere man. Such men as would have kept watch should scarcely have had difficulty in dealing with a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, as Strauss described Jesus. Also, the punishment for falling asleep while on watch was death, so the guard would have been wide awake. Right, they'd have been too scared to fall asleep because they knew that if they'd been caught falling asleep, that they could have been executed for their carelessness and falling asleep. McDowell says if Jesus had merely revived from a swoon, the long walk to a village named Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem, would have been impossible. He wouldn't have had any energy to do that if he was just a mere man, if he had survived a swoon. Day says on the evidence for the resurrection, or E. Hermitage Day again, says a long walk followed by the appearance to the disciples at Jerusalem is inconceivable in the case of one recovered from a swoon caused by wounds and exhaustion. Right, he would not have been in a physical state to be able to make such a journey. Ernest Kevan, in his work The Resurrection of Christ, says on his feet, which had been pierced through and through only 2 days back, he walks without difficulty the 2 leagues between Emmaus and Jerusalem. Right, how can he walk if he's had a nail go through his Achilles? How can he walk? He walks without difficulty the 2 leagues between Emmaus and Jerusalem. He's so active that during the repast he disappears suddenly out of sight of his fellow travelers, and when they return to the capital to announce the good news of the apostles, they find him there again. He's overtaken them. With the same quickness which characterizes all his movements, he presents himself suddenly in the room in which the disciples are assembled. All these the actions of a man who'd just been taken down half dead from the cross and who'd been laid in a grave in a condition of complete exhaustion? No. So Jesus is showing physical strength that wouldn't be possible from somebody who had just survived a swoon. But see, he's no mere man. So this is divine miracle we're talking about, not just human physical strength. McDowell, if Jesus had merely revived from a death-like swoon, he would have explained his condition to the disciples. Remaining silent, he would have been a liar and deceiver, allowing his followers to spread a resurrection proclamation that was really a resurrection fairy tale. Right. There should be some record of Jesus telling his disciples, hey guys, I wasn't really dead. I just had passed out for a little while, a couple days, and I swooned and came back to life. I wasn't really dead. Then what about all the predictions that he made of his death before his death? So he would have also had to have gone back and said, hey guys, when I predicted my death to you, I was really lying. Well, how could lies back up? How could lies about predicting his death, how would you explain that in light of all the miracles they witnessed him do? He would have had to not have God's power on him, but rather Satan's, who is a liar from the beginning. But of course, Jesus is God, and he is no liar. It is impossible for God to lie. So this could not be. He's really God. He really rose from the dead. Camus writes, let us say, moreover, that if Jesus had only swooned, he could not, without injury to his character, allow anyone to believe that he'd been dead. Instead of presenting himself as one risen again, he should have simply said, preserved by chance. Yes, instead of presenting himself as one risen from the dead, he should have been simply preserved. Yes, when he was predicting his resurrection, he should have said, hey guys, I'm not really going to die. I'm just going to swoon. And in some of those predictions, he said he would rise again. Rather than say risen again, he should say, yeah, I'm going to swoon and then I'm just going to come back from a swoon. No, he didn't say that. Okay, in fact, here, as everywhere else in the gospel, we encounter this insurmountable dilemma. Either Jesus was the just one, the man of God, or among men the greatest of criminals. Right, because he would have been propounding lies. If he presented himself as one from the dead, whereas he was not such, he's guilty of falsehood and must be denied even the most common honesty. Right. Paul Little comments that such a theory requires us to believe that Christ himself was involved in flagrant lies. Exactly. His disciples believed and preached that he was dead but became alive again. Jesus did nothing to dispel this belief, but rather encouraged it. Right. He rose from the dead. John Knox, the New Testament scholar, is quoted by Stratton. It was not the fact that a man had risen from the dead, but that a particular man had done so, which launched the Christian movement. The character of Jesus was its deeper cause. Jesus, McDowell says, would have had no part in perpetrating the lie that he had risen from the grave if he had not. Such an allegation is unreservedly impugned as one examines his spotless character. Right. Jesus, the Son of God, the God-man, in whom is no darkness. God is light, in him is no darkness at all. That includes telling lies. If you've seen him, you've seen the Father. He did what his Father commanded him to do, and it's impossible for God to lie. Jesus would not have lied about his resurrection when he had merely swooned. It was a real resurrection. If Jesus did not die at this time, then when did he die and under what circumstances? Right, exactly. If this was a mere resuscitation, a mere swooning, a mere resurrection, then there then there must have been a later death. Of course, we don't have any record of that. Even the skeptics who agree that he is a real historical person don't have the proof of his body in the tomb. They don't have proof of his subsequent death. But it's interesting because the book of Acts records his ascension into heaven. It records his death. It records his resurrection. Well, the Gospels record his death and his resurrection, and the book of Acts records his ascension. So when did he die? If he merely swooned, when did he really die? Well, he did really die. He rose again, and then he went up to heaven in the first chapter of the book of Acts and ascended into heaven to the right hand of the Father. Day asserts, if the swoon theory be accepted, it's necessary to eliminate from the Gospels and the Acts the whole ascension narrative, and to account for the sudden cessation of Christ's appearances by the supposition that he withdrew himself from them completely to live and die in absolute seclusion, leaving them with a whole series of false impressions concerning his own person and their mission from him to the world. Right. That's what I was just saying before the slide. I've written these slides a while ago and forgot the sequence of things. So now we've got William Milligan. He says that if Christ merely swooned on the cross and later revived, Milligan says he must have retired to some solitary retreat unknown even to the most attached of his disciples. While his church was rising around him, shaking the old world to its foundations and introducing everywhere amid many difficulties a new order of things, while it was torn by controversies, surrounded by temptation, exposed to trials, placed in short in the very circumstances that made it most dependent on his aid, he was absent from it, and spending the remainder of his days, whether few or many, in what can be described as no other term other than ignoble solitude. And then, at last, he must have died. No one can say either where, when, or how. There is not a ray of light to penetrate the darkness, and these early Christians, so fertile, we're told in legends, have not a single legend to give us help. Right, so if he merely swooned and later revived, what happened to him? This is why it's very helpful to believe the record of Scripture, because it tells us that he ascended, and that he really died, and that he really rose, and that he ascended. So with George Hanson, one can honestly say of the swoon theory, it's hard to believe that this was the favorite explanation of 18th century rationalism. The evidence speaks so much to the contrary of such a hypothesis that it is now obsolete. The swoon theory is obsolete. So next time, we're going to talk about the theft theory, which is another inadequate theory about the resurrection. So until that time, thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing my published work, the 30-chapter volume, the volume on the 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day. Thank you very much.